The city buzzed with the usual chaos of a late afternoon. Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie as he exited the office building downtown, the weight of the meeting still lingering on his shoulders. His mind was already racing with plans for the evening, dinner with his son, a bit of work on his community project, maybe even catching a game on TV. As he reached the sidewalk, he fished his car keys from his pocket, mentally running through the tasks ahead. "Mr. Thompson," a voice called out behind him. Marcus turned, startled to see an old colleague from his mentorship program. They exchanged pleasantries, briefly discussing an upcoming event, before Marcus politely excused himself and continued toward his car. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, but he brushed it off as paranoia, a remnant of the stress from the meeting. As he approached his car, a sleek black sedan parked neatly by the curb, he noticed the police cruiser just a few spaces down. A white officer, his blonde hair catching the dying sunlight, was leaning against the vehicle, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken slightly, but kept his stride even. "Afternoon, officer," Marcus greeted as he reached his car, unlocking it with a click. He tried to ignore the weight of the officer's gaze. "Sir, can I see your license and registration?" The officer's voice was cold, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Marcus blinked, taken aback. "Sure, but may I ask why?" "We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in a recent theft," the officer replied, stepping forward, his hand resting lightly on his belt, too close to the holster for Marcus's comfort. Marcus handed over his documents, keeping his expression neutral. "This is my car. I just came from a meeting downtown." The officer, John Riley, scrutinized the documents as if searching for something out of place. "What's your business downtown?" Marcus suppressed a sigh. "I'm an entrepreneur. I was at a meeting with a client." Riley's blue eyes flicked from the papers back to Marcus, suspicion still clouding his expression. "Mind if I check the car, sir?" Marcus hesitated, sensing that this situation was already spiraling out of control. "Is that really necessary? I haven't done anything wrong." Riley's lips thinned. "Sir, please step aside while I conduct the search." Marcus felt a pang of anger, but kept it in check. This wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, and he knew that losing his temper would only make things worse. He stepped back, allowing Riley to open the car door and begin his search. As the officer rifled through the glove compartment, Marcus's thoughts drifted to his son, David. How could he explain this to him? The boy idolized his father, and Marcus had always strived to be a role model, teaching David the values of patience, understanding, and integrity. But moments like this tested those values in the harshest way. Riley's voice broke through his thoughts. "What's this?" Marcus looked over to see Riley holding his journal, a leather-bound book Marcus carried everywhere. It was a place where he poured his thoughts, frustrations, and dreams. He had started it years ago, after one too many instances like this, where his dignity was questioned for no reason other than the color of his skin. "It's just a journal," Marcus replied evenly, though he felt a sting of vulnerability. Riley's eyes flickered with something. Curiosity? Contempt? It was hard to tell. "Mind if I take a look?" "Actually, I do mind," Marcus said, more firmly this time. "That's private." Riley considered this, his gaze cold and calculating. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back while I finish my inspection." Marcus took a deep breath, moving a few paces away, his mind racing with the injustice of the situation. He watched as Riley continued to search through his car, the violation of his privacy gnawing at him. Every fiber of his being told him to say something, to demand his rights, but he knew how that would end. Instead, he clenched his fists, waiting for this nightmare to be over. Finally, Riley stepped back, tossing the journal onto the passenger seat as if it was of no consequence. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, though his tone lacked any hint of apology. Marcus nodded, swallowing his frustration. "May I go now?" Riley nodded, but there was a lingering tension in the air. As Marcus climbed into his car, he could feel the officer's eyes on him, judging him, doubting him. The engine roared to life, and as Marcus pulled away from the curb, he could see Riley watching him in the rearview mirror until he turned the corner. The drive home was a blur. Marcus's thoughts were a storm of anger and disbelief. How could this still be happening? How many more times would he have to prove himself, to justify his existence in spaces where he belonged just as much as anyone else? When he arrived home, the quiet of the house did little to soothe his nerves. David's voice drifted from the living room, bright and full of life. As he talked to his mother, Clara, Marcus paused in the hallway, taking a moment to compose himself before stepping inside. Clara looked up from the couch, her expression softening when she saw him. "Hey, you're home. How was the meeting?" Marcus forced a smile, trying to push the afternoon's events to the back of his mind. "It went well, productive. Just tired." David bounded over, his eyes wide with excitement. "Dad, you have to see this new project I'm working on for school. It's about space exploration." Marcus knelt down, ruffling David's hair affectionately. "I can't wait to see it, champ. But first, I need to freshen up a bit, okay?" David nodded, his enthusiasm undimmed as he returned to his project. Clara watched Marcus closely as he made his way to their bedroom, sensing that something was off. Once inside, Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of what had happened. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them over his face, trying to shake the lingering unease. Clara entered the room quietly, closing the distance between them. "Marcus," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "What happened?" He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. "I was stopped by the police on my way home." Clara's face tightened. "What did they want?" Marcus exhaled slowly, recounting the encounter in a low, steady voice. As he spoke, Clara's expression shifted from concern to anger, her grip on his arm tightening. "That's unbelievable," she said when he finished. "You didn't do anything wrong, and they treated you like a criminal." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "But what could I do? I couldn't fight back, not without making things worse." Clara shook her head, her frustration clear. "This isn't right, Marcus. It shouldn't be like this. We shouldn't have to live in fear every time you walk out the door." Marcus nodded, his heart heavy. "I know, but it's the reality we live in." There was a long silence as they stood there, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "We need to teach David about this, Marcus. He needs to understand what the world is like, but also how to stand up for himself." Marcus sighed, running a hand over his head. "I know, but how do you explain something like this to a 10-year-old? "We'll find a way," Clara said, her determination unwavering. "He needs to know, and so do others. We can't let this keep happening." Marcus nodded, feeling a small spark of hope amidst the darkness. "You're right. We'll figure it out. Together." The conversation left them both feeling the gravity of the situation, but also a renewed sense of purpose. They couldn't change the past, but they could shape the future, starting with their son. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of mundane tasks, dinner, homework, and bedtime routines. But the encounter with Riley stayed with Marcus, gnawing at him as he sat alone in the living room later that night. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound as he stared at the journal on the coffee table. It was just a book, filled with his thoughts and dreams, but tonight it felt like so much more. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he wanted to protect. As he reached for it, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let today's events go unanswered. He owed that to himself, to Clara, and most of all, to David. But for now, he needed to rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and he needed to be ready. As Marcus closed his eyes, his thoughts were already on the next steps. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Riley bristled slightly, his shoulders tensing. "I followed protocol, Sergeant. Better safe than sorry." The sergeant sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just make sure you're not letting your gut get the better of you. We've been getting a lot of heat lately about profiling. Don't need any more bad press." Riley nodded curtly, though the words stung. He turned away from the desk, his eyes drifting to the car keys he had taken from Marcus. His gaze narrowed on the keychain, a small, worn leather tag with the name Marcus Thompson engraved on it. It looked old, well-used, like something someone carried with him for years. Unable to shake a growing sense of unease, Riley walked back to the holding cell. Marcus looked up as he approached, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to need you to stay here a little longer," Riley said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Riley's. "You're making a mistake, officer. I've done nothing wrong." Riley didn't respond, instead turning on his heel and heading for the door. As he reached for the handle, he hesitated, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. There was something in the man's calm demeanor, the quiet assurance that made Riley second-guess himself. But he pushed the thought aside. He had a job to do, and he couldn't let doubts cloud his judgment. Leaving Marcus behind, Riley made his way to the parking lot where the black sedan was still parked. He approached the car, the cool evening air doing little to dispel the tension in his chest. He unlocked the driver's door and slid into the seat, his eyes scanning the interior. Everything was neat, orderly, the kind of car owned by someone who took pride in their possessions. He opened the glove compartment, rifling through the contents until his fingers brushed against the leather cover of the journal. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hands. The journal was unremarkable at first glance, but something about it drew him in. He flipped it open to the first page, his eyes skimming the neat handwriting. "It's not easy being a black man in America. You're expected to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And even then, there's always someone ready to tear you down, to remind you that no matter what you achieve, you're still just another black man in their eyes." A knot formed in Riley's stomach as he read. The words were raw, honest. They spoke of experiences he couldn't fully understand, but they carried a weight that was undeniable. As he continued reading, he found himself drawn deeper into Marcus's world, his struggles, his hopes, his fears. The journal wasn't just a collection of thoughts. It was a window into a life shaped by circumstances Riley had never considered. He snapped the journal shut, a wave of discomfort washing over him. What was he doing? This was evidence, not some story for him to get lost in. But even as he told himself that, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line. He had invaded something deeply personal, something sacred. He got out of the car, locking it behind him as he headed back into the station. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and doubt. Had he made a mistake? Was Marcus telling the truth all along? Back inside, Riley made his way to the break room, where a few other officers were gathered, sipping coffee and chatting idly. He took a cup from the counter, filling it with the bitter brew, but his mind was elsewhere. "Riley, you good?" one of the officers, a burly man named Jenkins, asked. Riley nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. "Yeah, just a long day." Jenkins chuckled. "Aren't they all? Heard you brought someone in. What's the story?" "Suspected car theft," Riley replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "But I'm not so sure anymore." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Riley hesitated, then shook his head. "Never mind. It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and Riley knew it. The words in Marcus's journal echoed in his mind, making him question everything he thought he knew. He drained his coffee and set the cup down, the decision forming in his mind before he fully realized it. He needed to know more. Leaving the break room, Riley walked down the hall to the evidence room, where the keys to Marcus's car were stored. As he retrieved them, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He knew he was about to open a door that might never close again, but he couldn't stop himself. He returned to the parking lot and opened the trunk of Marcus's car, expecting to find something, anything, that would justify his actions. But the trunk was empty, save for a few personal items. A gym bag, a spare tire, some tools. Nothing suspicious, nothing that screamed criminal. Riley let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't a case of clear-cut guilt. It was something much more complicated, and it scared him. Back in the station, Marcus was sitting in the cell, his patience wearing thin. He could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant chatter of officers, but none of it mattered. What mattered was getting out of here and back to his family. The sound of footsteps approaching broke his reverie. He looked up to see Riley standing outside the cell, a set of keys in his hand. "You're free to go," Riley said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Marcus stood slowly, his eyes narrowing. What changed? Riley hesitated, then sighed. I read your journal. The admission hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus felt a surge of anger. You had no right to do that. I know, Riley said quietly, but I did. And I realized I might have been wrong about you. Marcus didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on Riley, searching for any hint of insincerity. But Riley's expression was earnest, his posture tense as if waiting for judgment. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice controlled. That doesn't change what you did. You violated my privacy, my rights. I know, Riley repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. I can't undo that, but I can try to make it right. Marcus crossed his arms, his eyes never leaving Riley's. And how do you plan to do that? Riley hesitated, then nodded toward the station. Come with me. There's someone you should meet. Curiosity piqued, Marcus followed Riley down the hall to a small office. Inside was a woman with dark skin and tightly coiled hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked up from her desk as they entered, her sharp eyes assessing the situation immediately. Detective Sarah Mitchell, she introduced herself, standing and offering her hand to Marcus. I've heard a lot about you. Marcus shook her hand, his mind racing. From who? From the community, Sarah replied, her tone matter of fact. I work closely with a lot of the outreach programs you've been involved in. I've been meaning to connect with you, but I didn't expect it to be under these circumstances. Marcus shot a glance at Riley, who looked uncomfortable. What's going on here? Sarah leaned against her desk, her gaze steady. Officer Riley came to me with some concerns about your arrest. After looking into it, I have to agree that there's no basis for your detainment. You're free to go, Mr. Thompson, and I want to apologize on behalf of the department for what happened. Marcus felt a mix of relief and lingering anger. An apology isn't going to erase what I went through today. I understand that, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm, but I want to make sure this doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else. There was a sincerity in her words that Marcus couldn't ignore. He took a deep breath, trying to let go of the tension that had been building all day. What now? Now, we make sure your rights are upheld, Sarah replied, her expression resolute, and we start by filing a report on what happened today. If you're willing, I'd like to hear your side of the story. Marcus glanced at Riley, who nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of his mistakes. Then he looked back at Sarah, appreciating her straightforward approach. All right, Marcus said finally, let's do this. They spent the next hour in Sarah's office, going over the details of the arrest, the events leading up to it, and Marcus's experience. Riley stayed in the background, his silence heavy with the weight of his actions. As Marcus recounted the day's events, he felt a sense of catharsis, as if finally speaking his truth allowed him to regain some of the control he had lost. When they finished, Sarah thanked Marcus and assured him that the report would be filed immediately. She also promised to follow up with him about any developments. As they left the office, Marcus turned to Riley, who seemed uncertain of what to say. This isn't over, Marcus said, his tone not angry but firm. But I appreciate you trying to make things right. Riley nodded, his expression solemn. I know I can't undo what happened, but I'll do better. That's a promise. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a brief nod. I hope so. With that, Marcus turned and walked out of the station, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, anger, but also a glimmer of hope. The day had been a nightmare, but perhaps something good could come of it. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Marcus pulled out his phone, dialing Clara's number. It rang twice before she answered, her voice filled with worry. Marcus, where are you? Are you okay? I'm fine, Marcus reassured her, smiling despite everything. I'm coming home. And for the first time that day, he truly believed it. The news spread like wildfire. What had started as a quiet evening arrest was now the talk of the city. By the time Marcus Thompson returned home, the local news stations were already buzzing with reports of his detainment. The story of a successful black businessman wrongfully arrested on suspicion of car theft was a headline too sensational to ignore. And as the details emerged, particularly the reading of his personal journal by the arresting officer, the public outcry grew louder. Inside his home, Marcus sat in the living room with Clara and David. The TV was on, muted, as a reporter stood outside the police station, delivering the latest updates. Marcus watched the screen with a tight jaw, his mind replaying the events of the day. "I can't believe this is happening," Clara said, her voice filled with disbelief as she watched the reporter. "This should never have gone this far." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "but now, it's out of our hands." David, sitting quietly between them, looked up at his father. "Dad, why are they saying all those things about you on TV?" Marcus turned to his son, seeing the confusion and worry in his young eyes. He struggled to find the right words. "Sometimes, people make mistakes, David, and sometimes, those mistakes can hurt others. But what's important is that we don't let those mistakes define us." David nodded slowly, though the furrow in his brow showed he was still trying to understand. Clara wrapped an arm around her son, pulling him close. "We're going to get through this, okay? As a family." Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up, seeing the name Detective Sarah Mitchell on the screen. With a sigh, he answered. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah's voice came through, calm and professional. "I wanted to give you a heads up. The media's gotten hold of the story, and it's escalating quickly. We need to prepare for what comes next." Marcus ran a hand over his face. "I figured as much. What do you suggest?" "I think it's important we get ahead of this," Sarah said. "We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of control. That means making a public statement, setting the record straight." Marcus hesitated, glancing at Clara. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "I understand," Sarah replied gently. "But the longer we wait, the more distorted the story becomes. We need to be proactive, not reactive." There was a long pause as Marcus considered her words. He knew she was right, but the idea of putting himself out there, vulnerable to public scrutiny, was daunting. "All right," he said finally. "What do I need to do?" "We'll arrange a press conference," Sarah said. "I'll be there with you, along with our legal team. We'll go over everything beforehand to make sure you're comfortable with what's being said." Marcus nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. "Okay, let's do it." As he hung up the phone, Clara looked at him with concern. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but I don't think we have a choice." The next day, the police station was surrounded by reporters, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every moment. Marcus stood in a small conference room inside the station, adjusting his tie nervously as Sarah briefed him on the plan. "Just be honest," Sarah advised, her tone reassuring. "Speak from the heart. This is your chance to tell your side of the story." Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. "Right. Speak from the heart." The door opened, and Officer Riley stepped in, looking as uncomfortable as Marcus felt. He cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "Mr. Thompson." "Marcus, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know I'm truly sorry for what I did." Marcus looked at Riley, his expression unreadable. "What made you change your mind?" Riley hesitated, glancing at Sarah before speaking. "Reading your journal. It made me realize that I was wrong about you. About a lot of things. I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right." There was a long silence as Marcus considered Riley's words. He could see the sincerity in the officer's eyes, the weight of his guilt. "It's not just about making it right for me," Marcus said finally. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Riley nodded, his face somber. "I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to help." "Then let's start by being honest out there," Marcus said, gesturing toward the door. "No more hiding behind excuses." Riley swallowed hard, but he nodded in agreement. "I'll follow your lead." The press conference was a whirlwind of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Marcus stood at the podium, Sarah and Riley at his side, feeling the weight of countless eyes on him. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium as he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he started, his voice steady despite the nerves. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I want to tell you what happened to me yesterday." The room quieted as Marcus recounted the events, from the moment he was stopped by Riley to the invasive search of his car and the reading of his personal journal. He spoke candidly, his voice carrying the pain and frustration he felt. But he also spoke with a determination that was undeniable. "What happened to me was wrong," Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But I'm not here to point fingers or seek revenge. I'm here because this incident highlights a much larger issue, one that affects many people in this community and across this country." He paused, letting his words sink in. Racial profiling and unjust treatment by law enforcement are not new issues. They're deeply rooted in our society, and they've caused harm to countless individuals and families. What happened to me is just one example of a much bigger problem. The room was silent, the reporters hanging on his every word. Marcus felt a surge of emotion as he spoke, knowing that this was his chance to make a difference. "I'm asking for change," he said, his voice firm. "Not just for me, but for everyone who has been affected by these issues. We need to hold ourselves and each other accountable. We need to work toward a system that treats everyone with fairness and respect, regardless of the color of their skin." As he finished, there was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. Marcus glanced at Riley, who stepped forward, his expression somber. "I want to apologize," Riley said, his voice cracking slightly, "to Mr. Thompson and to everyone who has been wronged by actions like mine. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and that's something I deeply regret. But I'm committed to learning from this and to being part of the solution, not the problem." The room was silent as Riley stepped back, his words hanging in the air. Marcus nodded to him, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before turning back to the crowd. "This isn't the end of the conversation," Marcus said, his tone resolute. "This is just the beginning, and I hope you'll join me in working toward a better future for all of us." The press conference ended with a flurry of questions, but Marcus and the others left the room, knowing they had said what needed to be said. As they walked down the hallway, Marcus felt a sense of relief mixed with uncertainty. He knew that this was just the first step in a long journey, but it was a step in the right direction. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. The media coverage was relentless, with Marcus's story dominating headlines and sparking debates across the country. The public reaction was mixed. Some praised Marcus for his courage in speaking out, while others criticized him for playing the race card. But regardless of the opinions, one thing was clear. The conversation had started, and it wasn't going away. Marcus spent most of his time fielding calls from journalists, community leaders, and even politicians, all wanting to weigh in on the issue. It was overwhelming, but Marcus knew this was his chance to make a real impact. He worked closely with Sarah and other advocates to push for policy changes within the police department and to raise awareness about the broader issues of racial profiling and police misconduct. But not everyone was on board. The backlash from certain groups was fierce, with some accusing Marcus of trying to divide the community or of seeking attention for his own gain. The pressure was intense, and there were moments when Marcus wondered if he had done the right thing by speaking out. One evening, as he sat in his living room, exhausted from another day of interviews and meetings, Clara sat down beside him. She placed a hand on his arm, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing the right thing, Marcus," she said softly. "Don't let the negativity get to you." "I know," Marcus replied, though his voice was heavy with doubt. "But it's hard. I never wanted to be in the spotlight like this." Clara nodded, understanding. "But you were put in this position for a reason. You have a voice, and people are listening. That's powerful." Marcus looked at her, seeing the unwavering support in her eyes. "I just hope it's enough." "It will be," Clara said firmly, "because you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who's been through something like this. And that's what matters." Her words gave Marcus the strength he needed to keep going. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it, no matter what. As the weeks passed, the momentum continued to build. Marcus's story became a rallying cry for those fighting for justice and equality, and the pressure on the police department grew. Sarah worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pushing for reforms and holding meetings with community leaders and law enforcement officials. But the fight was far from over. The more progress they made, the more resistance they encountered. There were threats, both overt and subtle, from those who wanted to maintain the status quo. But Marcus refused to back down. He knew that this was bigger than him. This was about changing a system that had been broken for far too long. One day, as Marcus was leaving a meeting with Sarah, he received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Thompson?" The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an edge to it. "This is Congressman Williams. I've been following your story, and I'd like to meet with you to discuss some potential legislation that could address the issues you've raised." Marcus was taken aback. "Congressman, I'm honored, but I'm not sure how I can help with that." "You've already done more than you realize," Williams replied. "Your story has brought attention to an issue that many of us in Washington have been trying to address for years. I believe that with your input, we can make some real changes." Marcus was silent for a moment, processing the weight of the offer. "I'd be happy to help in any way I can." "Good," Williams said, his tone firm. "Because this is just the beginning, Mr. Thompson. We have a lot of work to do." As Marcus hung up the phone, he felt a surge of determination. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they were making real progress. And he knew that as long as they kept pushing forward, there was hope for a better future. The chapter ends with Marcus sitting alone in his office, reflecting on how much his life has changed in such a short time. He opens his journal, the same one that had started it all, and begins to write. The words flow easily, a mix of hope and resolve. As he writes, he realizes that this is not just his story anymore. This is the story of a movement, of a community coming together to demand change. And in that moment, Marcus knows that no matter what happens next, he's ready to face it. Because this is bigger than him, bigger than any one person. This is about justice, about equality, about finally making things right. And it's a fight worth fighting. The city streets were electric with tension. Protests had erupted in response to Marcus's story, spreading from small gatherings to full-blown marches across the city. Signs demanding justice and chanting voices filled the air, echoing through the buildings. As the movement gained momentum, it became clear that this was more than just about Marcus. It was about a community tired of being unheard. Inside the police station, the atmosphere was equally charged. Officers moved with a sense of unease, the recent events weighing heavily on everyone. The usual hum of the station was replaced with a quieter, more introspective tone as officers and staff members tried to process the unfolding situation. Detective Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a whiteboard in a small conference room, reviewing notes from the past few days. Her focus was interrupted by a knock on the door. She looked up to see John Riley standing in the doorway, his expression conflicted. "Sarah, can we talk?" Riley asked, his voice betraying his internal struggle. "Sure," Sarah replied, setting her notes aside. She gestured to a chair. "Have a seat." Riley entered the room but remained standing, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he looked at the floor. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," he began, his voice heavy. "And I can't shake the feeling that I'm responsible for all of this." Sarah watched him carefully, understanding the weight of his words. "You made a mistake, John. A big one. But recognizing that is the first step toward making things right." Riley looked up at her, his blue eyes clouded with regret. "I never thought of myself as someone who could be so blind. I always thought I was doing the right thing, following protocol. But I see now that I let my own biases guide my actions." Sarah nodded, her tone measured. "It takes a lot to admit that. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Riley sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know where to start. The protests, the anger. It's all because of what I did. How do I even begin to fix that?" Sarah leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "You start by listening. Really listening to the people who have been affected by this. You need to confront the reality of what they're experiencing, not just as an officer, but as a human being." Riley nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I want to do better, Sarah, but I'm not sure how to get there." "There's no easy path," Sarah replied, "but it starts with accountability. And right now, that means being honest with yourself and with the community." Riley looked at her, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I'm willing to try." Outside the station, the protests had reached a fever pitch. The crowd had grown, their chants becoming more coordinated, more powerful. Marcus stood on the steps of the station, flanked by community leaders and activists, feeling the energy of the crowd pulsing through him. He had agreed to speak at the protest, knowing that his words would carry weight. As he stepped up to the microphone, the noise of the crowd quieted, anticipation hanging in the air. "Thank you for being here," Marcus began, his voice strong despite the nerves. "Thank you for standing up for what's right." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, all of them united by a shared cause. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "This is about all of us, about a system that has failed too many people for too long." The crowd murmured in agreement, the tension palpable. "We're here today because we demand justice," Marcus said, his voice rising with emotion. "Not just for me, but for everyone who has been treated unfairly, who has been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. We're here because we believe in a future where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The crowd erupted into cheers, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. "But this fight isn't over," Marcus continued once the noise had died down. "We have a long road ahead of us, and it's going to take all of us working together to make real change. We need to hold our leaders accountable, our institutions accountable, and ourselves accountable. Because this isn't just about changing laws, it's about changing hearts and minds." As he spoke, Marcus noticed a figure at the edge of the crowd, standing slightly apart from the others. It was Riley, watching the protest with a conflicted expression. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Marcus saw the struggle in the officer's gaze, the guilt, the uncertainty, but also a hint of resolve. Marcus turned back to the crowd. "We can't do this alone. We need allies in this fight, people who are willing to stand with us, to listen, to learn, and to act. This isn't just about black and white, us and them. It's about all of us coming together to build a better future." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And that future starts now." The crowd roared in approval, their cheers filling the air as Marcus stepped back from the microphone, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. As he walked down the steps, the community leaders patted him on the back, their faces alight with hope and determination. But Marcus's thoughts were on Riley, still standing at the edge of the crowd, looking lost in his own emotions. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus made his way toward the officer, threading through the sea of people until he reached him. "Riley," Marcus said, his tone calm but direct. Riley looked up, surprised to see Marcus approaching him. "Marcus, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Well, I wasn't expecting to see you either," Marcus replied, crossing his arms. "But I'm glad you came." Riley looked away, his expression conflicted. "I don't know what I'm doing here, to be honest. I'm not sure I belong." "Why not?" Marcus asked, his gaze steady. "Because I'm the reason all of this is happening," Riley said, his voice tinged with regret. "I made a mistake, and now I don't know how to fix it." Marcus studied Riley for a moment, then nodded. "You can start by listening, and by understanding that this isn't just about one mistake. It's about a system that's been broken for a long time. If you're serious about making things right, you need to be willing to do the work." Riley nodded slowly, the weight of Marcus's words settling on him. "I want to help," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I want to be part of the solution." "Then show up," Marcus said simply. "Not just today, but every day. Be the change you want to see." Riley met Marcus's gaze, a new determination in his eyes. "I will." As the days passed, the city continued to grapple with the fallout from the protests. The police department was under intense scrutiny, and Sarah found herself at the center of it all. She had become a key figure in the push for reform, her position as a detective and her involvement in the community giving her a unique platform. One evening, she was in her office, reviewing reports from the recent protests, when her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Marcus. "Can we meet? I have something I want to discuss." Sarah responded quickly, setting up a time to meet the next morning. She could sense the urgency in Marcus's message, and she was curious to hear what was on his mind. The next day, they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, away from the prying eyes of the media. As they sat down, Sarah could see the tension in Marcus's face, the weight of the past few weeks clearly taking its toll. "What's going on, Marcus?" Sarah asked, her tone gentle. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. The protests, the press, the attention. It's all been overwhelming. Sarah nodded, understanding. It's a lot to deal with, but you've handled it well. I'm not so sure, Marcus replied, his voice filled with doubt. I feel like I've started something that I'm not sure how to finish. The expectations, they're so high. And I'm just one person. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You're not alone in this, Marcus. You have a community behind you, people who believe in what you're doing. I know, Marcus said, his gaze distant, but it feels like so much pressure. What if I let everyone down? You won't, Sarah said firmly. You've already done so much. And the fact that you're even worried about letting people down shows how much you care. That's what makes you a great leader. Marcus looked at her, the tension in his face easing slightly. I just don't want to make any more mistakes. Mistakes are part of the process, Sarah replied. What matters is how you respond to them. And from what I've seen, you've handled everything with integrity and strength. Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. Thanks, Sarah. I needed to hear that. She smiled, squeezing his arm gently. We're in this together, Marcus. And we're going to see it through, no matter what. As they left the cafe, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The doubts that had been gnawing at him were still there, but they were quieter now, overshadowed by the support and encouragement he had received from Sarah and the community. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles. But he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone, and that made all the difference. Later that evening, Marcus returned home to find David working on a school project at the kitchen table. Clara was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and the familiar smells and sounds of home brought a sense of calm to Marcus's weary mind. Hey, champ, Marcus greeted his son, ruffling his hair as he passed by. David looked up, a serious expression on his face. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course, Marcus replied, sitting down beside him. Why are people so angry? David asked, his young eyes filled with confusion. Why is everyone fighting? Marcus sighed, thinking carefully before answering. People are angry because they've been hurt, David. They're fighting because they want things to be fair and just for everyone. Sometimes, when things aren't fair, people have to stand up and make their voices heard. David nodded slowly, processing his father's words. But it's scary. It can be, Marcus agreed, but it's also important. Standing up for what's right can be hard, but it's something we have to do. It's how we make the world a better place. David looked at his father, his eyes wide with admiration. I want to be brave like you, Dad. Marcus smiled, feeling a swell of pride. You already are, buddy. And as long as you always try to do what's right, you'll be making a difference. David smiled, the seriousness lifting from his face. Okay. As they sat together, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Despite everything that had happened, he knew that he was on the right path. And with his family by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The chapter concludes with Marcus standing in front of the mirror that night, reflecting on the day's events. He sees in himself not just a man who has faced adversity, but someone who has the strength to lead others through it. The weight of responsibility is heavy, but it's a burden he's willing to bear. He looks at the journal on his nightstand, the very one that had sparked this journey. Picking it up, he opens it to a blank page and begins to write, the words flowing easily as he captures his thoughts and hopes for the future. As he writes, Marcus knows that the fight for justice is far from over. But he also knows that he has the power to make a difference, to inspire others to join him in the struggle for a better world. And that knowledge gives him the strength to keep going. The city was buzzing with the news, and every corner of the community seemed to have an opinion. Marcus Thompson, once just a respected local businessman, was now at the center of a nationwide conversation. As he stepped out of the police precinct, the air was thick with the weight of what had transpired. Camera flashes and voices echoed around him, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the next steps, on what this moment could mean for his family and the broader community. Marcus, Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the noise as she approached him, her expression a mix of relief and concern. Are you okay? Marcus nodded, though the exhaustion was evident in his eyes. I didn't think it would escalate this far, he admitted, glancing around at the crowd of reporters and protesters. But maybe it needed to. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've become a symbol, Marcus. People are listening. We just need to make sure that what they hear next is the right message. As they talked, John Riley watched from a distance, his heart heavy with regret. The transformation that had begun with the reading of Marcus's diary was now culminating in a public reckoning. His mind raced as he considered the words he needed to say, words that could either heal or further divide. Later that evening, Marcus returned home to find David sitting on the porch, his young face a mix of confusion and fear. "Dad, is everything going to be okay?" the boy asked, his voice trembling slightly. Marcus knelt down in front of his son, placing his hands on David's small shoulders. "David, things are going to change. But change doesn't always come easily or quickly. What's important is that we stand by what's right, even when it's hard." David looked into his father's eyes, searching for reassurance. "Are they mad at you because you told the truth?" Marcus smiled sadly. "Some people are, yes, but sometimes telling the truth makes people uncomfortable because it shows them things they don't want to see. But that doesn't mean we stop. It means we keep going." As the words hung in the air, the door creaked open and Marcus's wife, Lisa, stepped outside. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice soft but strong. The three of them walked inside together, the warmth of their home a stark contrast to the turmoil outside. Meanwhile, in his dimly lit living room, John Riley paced back and forth, wrestling with the decision he had made. He had contacted a local news station, asking for a live segment to address the situation. As the time approached, he could feel the weight of his badge in his hand, a symbol of authority that he now questioned more than ever. "Why now?" his wife, Karen, asked from the kitchen doorway, her tone more curious than accusatory. "You've been on the force for years, John. Why is this case different?" John paused, staring at the badge as if seeing it for the first time. "Because this time, I can't ignore it. Marcus." His words, they've been echoing in my head since I read them. They're forcing me to see things I didn't want to see. And if I don't speak up now, I don't know if I ever will." Karen nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. "Then say what you need to say, but make sure it's the truth." John looked at her, grateful for her support, and picked up the phone to confirm the interview. This was it, the moment that would define him, not just as a cop, but as a man. The next day, the city held its breath as John Riley's face appeared on the television screens across town. People gathered in bars, homes, and community centers, all eager to hear what he would say. "This isn't easy for me," John began, his voice steady but solemn. "I've been a police officer for over 20 years, and in that time, I've made judgments, some right, some wrong. But what happened with Marcus Thompson was a wake-up call, a moment that forced me to confront my own prejudices." In his home, Marcus watched silently, Lisa by his side. He could feel his heart pounding, the uncertainty of what John might say next weighing on him. "I read Marcus's diary, thinking I would find something incriminating. Instead, what I found were the thoughts of a man who has faced obstacles I can't even begin to understand," John continued, his eyes reflecting the deep internal struggle he was sharing with the world. His words opened my eyes to the realities that people like him face every day, realities I was too blind to see. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." A hush fell over the room as John paused, gathering his thoughts. "I made a mistake that could have cost a man his freedom, his dignity. I won't pretend that an apology is enough, but it's a start. I've taken an oath to serve and protect, and that means serving every member of our community without prejudice, without bias. Moving forward, I promise to do better, to be better." As the broadcast ended, Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The room was silent for a moment before Lisa squeezed his hand. "It's not over, but it's a step in the right direction." Marcus nodded, a mixture of relief and uncertainty filling his chest. "Now, we need to figure out how to use this moment, how to keep the conversation going, to make sure it leads to real change." Sarah Mitchell arrived shortly after, her expression one of cautious optimism. "Did you see it? This could be the turning point we've been waiting for." "Maybe," Marcus replied thoughtfully, "but it's going to take more than just words. We need action, real, tangible action." Sarah nodded in agreement. I've already started reaching out to some of the community leaders. We need to organize, push for the reforms that are long overdue. Marcus looked at her, determination in his eyes. We're not just fighting for us, Sarah. We're fighting for David's future, for every kid like him who deserves to grow up in a world where they're treated with respect and dignity. As the days passed, the momentum grew. Marcus and Sarah worked tirelessly to mobilize the community, organizing town hall meetings and discussions that brought together people from all walks of life. The story of Marcus's wrongful arrest and John's public apology became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about race, policing, and justice across the country. In one such meeting, a young woman stood up, her voice trembling but filled with determination. My brother was killed in an incident just like this, but no one spoke up for him. What you're doing? It gives me hope that maybe things can be different. Her words hung in the air, and Marcus felt a deep sense of responsibility. We're going to keep fighting, he said, his voice strong. This isn't just about me or John Riley. It's about every single person who has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. And we won't stop until we see real change. The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the room palpable. It was a moment of unity, of collective resolve to push forward, no matter how long or difficult the road ahead might be. John Riley, meanwhile, found himself grappling with the aftermath of his public confession. While some lauded his courage, others within the police force saw it as a betrayal. He faced criticism, cold shoulders, and even threats from some of his colleagues. "You've turned your back on us," one officer spat, cornering him in the locker room. "Made us look like the enemy." John held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "If standing up for what's right makes me the enemy, then so be it. We're supposed to protect and serve everyone, not just those who look like us." The officer glared at him, but there was no longer any fear in John's heart. He knew that the path he had chosen was the right one, even if it meant walking it alone. The following weeks saw a series of reforms being introduced in the police department, many of them spurred by the relentless advocacy of Marcus, Sarah, and their growing coalition. Mandatory bias training, community policing initiatives, and independent oversight committees were just a few of the changes that began to take root. In a final meeting with the police chief, John Riley was offered early retirement, a way to step down quietly amid the controversy. But he refused. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly. "Not until I see these changes through." The chief sighed, clearly frustrated. "You know this isn't going to be easy, Riley. You're making a lot of enemies." John nodded. "I know, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure that what happened to Marcus never happens to anyone else. I've got a lot to make up for, and I'm not running away from that." As the sun set over the city, Marcus stood on the steps of the community center, watching as people from all walks of life gathered for yet another meeting. David stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. "Dad, do you think things will really change?" David asked, looking up at his father with hopeful eyes. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride and hope. "I think we're making a start, son. And as long as we keep fighting, keep pushing, change will come." And as they walked into the building together, Marcus felt a deep sense of purpose, a knowledge that this fight, this journey, was far from over, but that they were on the right path. For the first time in a long time, he believed that the future held the promise of something better, not just for him, but for everyone.